Welcome to this tutorial. Access a classic schema from SAP Business Application Studio. This is part of the tutorial group, Create Database Artifacts in SAP HANA Cloud. In this tutorial, we will access data in a plain or replicated schema from an HDI container in the SAP Business Application Studio. You will learn how to create a plain schema with a table and a user to simulate a replicated schema. You will also learn how to create a user-provided service to access a database in SAP HANA Cloud. And finally, you will learn how to grant permissions to the technical users in your HDI container to access the database. The prerequisites of this tutorial are that you have access to SAP HANA Cloud System. This tutorial is designed to be done in the SAP Business Technology Platform trial. You also need to have completed the SAP HANA database project, which is the previous tutorial in this group. Now, this tutorial is meant to be an example of cross-container access. Simple data models and loading mechanisms were chosen to simulate a schema replicated using tools such as SAP Landscape Transformation or an existing ABAP schema. For more information on the process and additional syntax options, please refer to the official help documentation on SAP Help. If you're looking for the steps for an on-premise HANA instance with XS Advanced, such as SAP HANA Express Edition, please refer to the additional tutorials listed in the description of this video. We're going to start with step one, which is to create our plain schema. So I'm going to return to the SAP Business Technology Platform cockpit of my trial account. And I'll go ahead and enter my account. And I want to navigate down into my sub-account. And then down to the space level. And at the space level, you have this option for SAP HANA Cloud. And then you can go to the Manage HANA Cloud, which will open in a new tab. Now, personally, I bookmark this other tool, the SAP HANA Cloud Central, so that I can go to it directly. But I wanted to show you the complete navigation if you didn't know where to find it. This is where you would go to stop and start your HANA system, which, remember, the SAP HANA Cloud trial does stop each night automatically and does have to be started manually each day you want to work on it. My system is already started, but from the same actions menu, I want to say Open SAP HANA Database Explorer. And that is going to launch the Database Explorer and bring us into a connection to the database using our DBA admin user, which is an important aspect of what we want to do here. Now, of course, as we saw in the previous tutorial, I could have launched the Database Explorer also from the Business Application Studio. I could have come here to our project that we're working on in the previous tutorial and click the Open HDI container. That would have centered us on the specific HDI container for this project. And we want to work in the general connection for the HO trial instance, which, of course, we could have launched the Database Explorer and then simply switched over to the other connection in the tool manually, but I wanted to show you how to get there directly using the admin capabilities. Now, what we want to do once we have our connection to our whole database instance, and you'll notice here it looks a little different. The catalog view has more items in it, and we are connected as the super admin user DB admin. I want to right mouse click and choose Open SQL Console. Now, I want to use some code here. I'm going to go back to the tutorial. I'm going to copy this because nobody wants to watch me type. But what this code is going to do is it's going to create a new schema called plain. It's going to create a user called PLUSR. It's going to set the password for that user and the user group. It's going to disable the lifetime. Then it's going to create a new table called regions, 2 columns. We're going to create a role And it's going to have, that role will have access to this new schema that we're going to create. And then we're going to grant this role to our user with admin options. And that's going to give this user the ability to also grant this role to other users. Now let's go ahead and run this. We can select a section at a time to run. So for instance, I'll create just the schema. And if we want, we can go ahead and verify that that schema is there. Yes. And now let's go ahead and create and alter our user. There we are. Now let's create our table. Table is created. We could now go see that. There we are. Our regions table exists. Let's create a role. And then perform the grants to the role, and then grant the role to our user. So this is all the setup that we need to both create our regular schema, our non-HDI container schema, and to then use that in the rest of this tutorial. So in this step, we've created a plain schema in our SAP HANA Cloud database. In the previous tutorial, when we deployed the database module, that created an instance of an HDI container, which ultimately also created a schema in the database. It was just automatically generated, and then it's managed for you by the technical users of the HDI container instance. But in the end, these are basically the same things. They're both schemas within the HANA database, and they can communicate with each other using synonyms, which is what we're going to do in the next step. So, first of all, we're going to need some data to load into this plain schema table. So let's go ahead. I'm going to come over here to the tutorial again, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab my data. And it's not a ton of data there. Let's just copy it. And now we want to go to our table, regions, and we're going to say import data. And although that wasn't a ton of data, let's go ahead and put it in a little import file here. And we're just going to copy this data into the file. There we are. And now we can say that we want to import data. And we want to import it from local. The file does have a header in the first row. And we can browse and find this file that I just created via the data we supplied to you. There we are. Step 3, it's read the file, and you have the choice of creating a table at this step based upon the structure of the import file. We've already created it manually with SQL, so we're just going to add the data to an existing file, and because we started the process by right mouse clicking on our table, that's how it knows which one we want to target. So that's fine. We'll go on to the next step, and it shows us the columns in our little CSV file source and allows us to map those. All those match the names already and map them correctly, so there's really nothing for us to do. We go on to the next step, and we want to go ahead with the default, which is save all successful rows and list any errors. So we'll go ahead and we'll review. This just gives us a chance to double check our settings, even allows us to preview the data that's going to be imported, and we can go ahead. We're happy with the settings. We can go ahead and say import into database, and it's running now, importing. And it saved all successful rows. Yeah, saved all successful records. There we are. So we can now say open data on our table and just double check and make sure it's all there. there it is. So we've now successfully imported data into our regular schema database table as well. So now we want to create the user provided service. Now that we have the schema with the table in the database, we want to be able to access it. And we have created a user called PLUSR that has all the permissions to perform the basic operations on this schema. We want to create a user-provided service. This is how we will grant access to the schema through the user that we created, but we're going to do the rest of this process from the HANA tools in the Business Application Studio. So let me go on back here to the Business Application Studio, and we're returning to the DM project that we started in the previous tutorial in this group. Remember, I've done this a couple of times, so I ended up naming mine DM3, but yours is probably named DM. That's fine. And what we want to do here is, if you don't have a terminal already open, let's just do terminal, new terminal. There we are. Now we have a command line terminal. Lets us do things. Oops, away from it. For instance, I can do CF services to list my services. Now, we'll continue with the command that we brought over from the tutorial. Cloud Foundry, create user-provided service, the name of the service, and then we have to pass in some parameters. What user do we want to connect to the database with? The PLUSR user that we created in the previous step. The password that we want to use to log into the HANA system. We're going to tag this as a HANA connection. And then we can set what is our default schema, which would be our newly created plain schema. Now notice there's no other connection parameters provided here, no host name, port, or anything like that. That's not needed because when you have a user-provided service used in conjunction with an HDI container, we'll automatically pull the connection parameters from the primary database connection, which is your HDI container, and we'll reuse those. That way we can simply specify less, and our user-provided service is then a bit more reusable and easier to set up. So that is created now. I can do a CF services to just check. CF services, there's CC access. It is user-provided service. Now, what we want to do is we want to add this to our project. This is quite easy to do with the SAP HANA Projects view. You see we have database connections in our project, our DM project. And if we want to create a new database connection besides the primary HDI container connection, we can just click the Add Database Connection button. And this is going to start a little wizard that will walk us through the process. And you've got several choices here. I can say I want to connect to an existing HDI container. Valid choice, but not what we're doing now. I could create a user-provided service, but we just created it manually. So I'm going to say existing user-provided service instance. And then it's going to give me a drop-down that shows me just the user-provided services in my space. And there's our CC access that we just created. And I can say add. And this is adding it to my project. So it's adding it to the MTA YAML file, and it's adding it to the .env file with all the configuration I need to connect to the database and use this service now. I don't have to, like in the old Web IDE wizard, now go in and monkey around with the MTA YAML. It has added this as a resource and already connected it to my database. So we are good to go. Now, from our database module, we want to create a new file. Now, this is going to be a grants file, and it must be created in the CFG folder, not the SRC. The differentiation will tell the HDI deployer that these files need to be processed before any of the database artifacts are created. That's why it's put in a separate folder, CFG for configuration. So we don't have a CFG folder, so we'll go ahead and create it as we create this first file. I'll name it plain.hdb grants. And this is going to be a file that's going to allow us to tell it what to grant when we do a deployment. So let me go ahead and get the syntax here. Let's copy it. We'll put it in. Basically, we're saying use the CC access connection. So the name of the user provided service. And for our technical users of our container, grant them, both the object owner and the application user, technical user, both grant them the CC role. Now, you have the ability to give different roles with different levels of access to your target schema to the two different technical users that are part of your HDI container. You could differentiate between the object owner, which performs all the create and update operations on the database artifacts in your HDI container itself, or the application user, which is used at runtime to access your HDI container. But for our purposes, we'll give the same access to both those sets of users. All right, now that we've set up the granting operation, let's go ahead and create our synonyms. So I'm just going to come here to my data folder, and I'm going to say new file, and I'm going to say regions.hdb synonym. And remember, you could also use the palette wizard to create new database artifacts and then choose the file type from the wizard with the drop-down list box. And if you're unsure about the file extensions, that's a good way to go. I'm fairly comfortable with them, so I'm using the shortcut of typing them here. Either approach works. But here is our synonym editor, and we want to add a new record. So I want to create a synonym named regions. And the target object will be named regions in schema plain. Okay. And the names are the same here, but they don't have to be. You can give your target object a different name when it's accessed within your HDI container. I personally prefer most of the time to give them the same name if I can. It just leads to less confusion. So let's go ahead and save that. That's everything we need to do. We're ready to now deploy this into the database. Do the deployment. Just be sure to do the deployment at the root level here to deploy the entire database module so that it sends both the config and source content into the database. Let's go ahead and do the deploy. And if everything works fine, yeah, it's looking good. Yep, successful. You will notice if you go back up through the logs, there's extra things going on here at the beginning because now we've got this grantor service, CC access, and it's setting that up, and it's processing our HDB grants, which is doing all the automatic granting of security to our technical users. So now our container can access the tables and other content in the target regular SQL schema. All right, the next step that we want to do is we want to create a view that will access content from our both the HDI container and the foreign schema. So let's start with the wizard here. I want to go to my data folder and find command. Use the SAP HANA database artifact. If that's not in your recently used, just type HANA to bring up the list of HANA-related commands. So we're going to create a new database artifact. And want to create it in the data folder. Yes, HANA Cloud. I want to create a regular SQL view. So it's just going to be HDB view artifact. And let's give it a name. Region text view. And go ahead and create. Now let's open that regions text view, which is not syntactically correct yet because it's not complete. Let's go give it our columns. I'm going to type this in. Region and description as select there. Oh, shoot. I wanted to show you the code completion. There we are, regions. And now if I do select region and description from regions. Yep, syntactically correct. No more errors or warnings. That looks good. Double check. I have autosave turned on, so it was already saved, but I like to be extra careful. And now we can just go ahead and deploy either at the root level in the whole project or just this one artifact. It's the only thing we changed. Let's just go ahead and do it at the artifact level. And it is complete. We can see that it deployed regions text view into the database. Now we want to verify that it's good. So let's go ahead and go back to the Database Explorer. So I still had the tab open to the other one. I could have just switched tabs as well. But in case you closed it, it takes me right to my HDI container. And now if I go to Views, let's close this other stuff from earlier. There's our regions text view. If I do Open Data, and we will see the data. And to complete the validation, what we want you to do is click on the SQL button. It will show you the SQL statement, which you need to put in the validation box, which I'm not going to do here, so you can go through the exercise yourself. Now, the final step is not actually one that most people should have to go through. But if you do get an error of insufficient privileges, which can happen if you didn't set up the user-provided service correctly or grant the role correctly, you might receive an error message, insufficient privilege. Detailed info for this error can be found with, and then it gives you a GUID. Now, if you get this message, you can get more information about the source of that error, and often the information you need to really troubleshoot and work out the core of the problem. But to do that, you need to issue another SQL statement, this get insufficient privilege error details from the sys schema, and you just pass in the GUID as the first parameter, and then you'll get a result table back. Now, this procedure will show you the session username, the technical user executing the statement, the privileges that were being executed, and some flags with is missing that will help you determine what's going on. A true value under one of those flags indicates missing authorizations. So if you do have a problem, you can use this to help troubleshoot. Of course, you can also always ask questions in the provide feedback link in the tutorial itself. But this will help you maybe troubleshoot some on your own. In the end, make sure that the user and the user-provided service has the permissions for select and select metadata with grant option. When you did your role setup, that's the first place that to look and where most people perhaps go wrong. This concludes this tutorial on SAP HANA Cloud accessing cross-container schemas. We've shown you in this group how to get started with a HANA database project to create database artifacts in an HDI container, how to create artifacts outside an HDI container, and then how to combine those two things and be able to grant access to, create synonyms for, and additional database artifacts on top of your external schema, which although we used a very small schema that we created by hand and we manually loaded some data in, it's far more likely that you might have replicated data coming from another data source like an ERP system, and all these same processes and techniques would then be applied to access that from your primary HDI container.